The forgotten ones, the underappreciated ones. But make no mistake about it, they gave your favorite team and player from the 80s so much trouble. During that decade, the Milwaukee Bucks had an impressive run. They had one dominant season after another. Even then, they haven't received their just due for a few reasons. They never won a title, they're a small market team, and they didn't have that one marquee superstar. It was easy to bypass them. But if you look closely, you'll quickly realize how great and revolutionary of a team they were. The foundation for this team started at the beginning of the NBA/ABA merger, the 1976/77 season. That is when they hired former Celtics player Don Nelson as an assistant coach. After 18 games, he was promoted as head coach. This was his first coaching gig, and he had a lot of work to do. This was a team that was suffering after losing the best player in the league, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, in the 1975 offseason. But Don Nelson had confidence in himself, and he gave this proposition to the front office. Give him 5 years, and he'll be able to turn this team into a powerhouse. The plan was to build through the draft. They drafted Marques Johnson later that year and Sidney Moncrief in 1979. By the turn of the decade, they were a top 5 team in their conference. Their young players were maturing quickly. All that they needed was a strong big man. Before the trade deadline, they got that and more. They acquired Detroit Pistons legend Bob Lanier. In Don Nelson's 5th year as a coach, he delivered what he promised. With all the pieces in place, the Bucks were a powerhouse in the NBA. In the 1980/81 season, they won 60 games. This was the beginning of a dominant 7-year stretch. They won 7 straight seasons of winning over 50 games. They averaged 52.2 wins for the decade. That is only behind the Lakers, Celtics, and Sixers. There were 3 seasons where they were a top 3 team regarding the number of wins. That was in 1981, 1985, and 1986. As far as playoff success, they reached the conference finals 3 times. That came in 1983, 1984, and 1986. It's hard for a team to sustain that kind of excellence for such a long period. What was the secret to their success? Their biggest strength during the early 80s were their strong defensive attack. Check out the numbers. In 1982, they finished with the best defensive rating in the league. In 1984 and 1985, they finished first in opponents' points per game and second in defensive rating. Their defensive greatness starts with the brilliant basketball mind of Don Nelson. He was an innovator in every sense of the word. He's mostly known for the way he revolutionized the offensive game, but he started out as a defensive-minded coach. One of his assistants during the time, Dale Harris, said that they were so dominant on that end of the floor, primarily because of the innovative stuff he did defensively, particularly in terms of rotations and switches. He was a pioneer in that area, but he wouldn't get that far if he didn't have a collection of great two-way players. And that is another reason why they were so successful. They were extremely deep, from 1 through 11. It was a revolving door of players that could do major damage to any team. The player that got the most credit for their success on defense was Sidney Moncrief. Did you know that he was the first player to win the Defensive Player of the Year award? That came in 1983, and then he won it again in 1984. His aggressive nature and constant hounding on the ball are what gave him the highest honor for a defensive player. On top of that, he was one of the best all-around players at the guard position. He was a relentless rebounder, he could score inside and out, and he was a great playmaker. With all those skills at his disposal, he finished 4th in MVP voting in 1983. At his peak, he was considered a top 5 player in the league. The same could be said about Marques Johnson. He was one of the league's best bucket getters. Although he could score at will, the numbers say that he decided to blend his skills with his teammates to allow them to shine. On top of being their leading scorer, he was also their best rebounder for a few seasons. Their ability to fill so many roles helped the Bucks stay dominant as Bob Lanier became more and more limited due to his advanced age. When he was healthy, he gave this team a whole different dynamic. To this day, he is considered one of the greatest shooting big men of all time. Don Nelson did not want to waste those skills. He had the 7-footer out in the perimeter, which allowed the Bucks to run a positionless motion offense. But that wasn't the only unique thing about their offense. During the 1984 playoffs, they made a change to their lineup that had a huge impact on the game. He switched to 6'7" Marques Johnson to the 1 spot out of necessity. His job was to set up the offense. According to Marques himself, he said he would be the point forward. Don Nelson saw the future. He saw how this would give them a whole new advantage over other teams. In the following season, he doubled down and he publicly called Paul Pressey their point forward. He was their leading assist man during the Don Nelson era. That's right, this team meant more to the game than you might have ever imagined. As of right now, we've only talked about one era of the 1980s Milwaukee Bucks. The first era ended abruptly after Marques Johnson was traded in the 1984 offseason. In a shocking deal, they sent him, six-man Junior Bridgman, and Harvey Catchings to the Los Angeles Clippers for Terry Cummings, Craig Hodges, and Ricky Pierce. To make a long story short, it seems Marques was traded due to drug problems, and they did their best to hide that fact from the Clippers. They later sued Milwaukee for concealing this information, as they claimed they would have never agreed to this deal if they knew about it. But that's a story we can get into for another day. Although they were getting heat for dealing away a big part of their core, it ended up working wonders for them. Marques only played 2 more full seasons before injuries ended his career. On the other hand, Terry Cummings was just getting started, and he fit perfectly with this group. Before the ascension of Charles Barkley and Karl Malone, Terry had a strong case for being the best power forward in the league. In his first season with the Bucks, he finished first in points and 5th in rebounds per game in his position. He was everything Donnie wanted for his system. He could bring the ball up the floor, finish strong, and he had a soft outside touch. They also did a great job of replacing a beloved bench player. Junior Bridgman was always among the top scorers for non-starters. There were 4 seasons where he averaged over 15 points per game. But after turning 30 years old, it was time for some new blood. They saw potential in Ricky Pierce, and he ended up becoming one of the greatest 6-man players ever. He has the hardware to prove it. He won the 6th Man of the Year award twice. In 1987, he was the team's second leading scorer with a 19.5 points per game average on 53% shooting. But that's not all. A few years after Bob Lanier retired, they replaced him with another Hall of Fame center. Jack Sigma was a fantastic shooting big man, and he was one of the few stretch 5 players at the time. The Bucks saw so many talented players throughout the decade, and there are plenty more that we didn't mention. It's no wonder that they experienced so much success. To have an idea of how great they were, we should look no further than the 1983 postseason. This is when they pulled the stunning feat of sweeping the Boston Celtics. They won the series by an average margin of 11.8 points. This was the only time Larry Bird got swept in the playoffs. Boston had no answers for the duo of Marques and Sidney as they ran this supposed juggernaut out of the floor. The Bucks lost 3 times to the Celtics in the playoffs during the 80s, so this playoff defeat must have felt nice for all Milwaukee fans. The same can be said about their 1986 playoff defeat against the Philadelphia 76ers. They lost to them 4 times from 1981 to 1985, but they got some sweet revenge in their semifinals matchup. It was a classic 7-game series that ended in a very dramatic way. Philadelphia gave up their 1-point lead after committing goaltending. Then on the other end, Julius Erving missed an open look that ended their season. I think I can speak for many Bucks fans when I say that those were their most satisfying playoff victories. So why couldn't they ever reach the finals if they were such a great team? The answer to that question is very simple. During that dominant 7-year stretch that we talked about, there were only 2 teams that they lost to in the playoffs: the Boston Celtics and the Philadelphia 76ers. The Eastern Conference ran through them during that time. They just didn't have enough star power to defeat those legendary teams. There's no shame to losing to all those Hall of Fame players. but you could always count on them to play them tough, and they were never an easy out. That's why they all have a deep respect for them, and every true NBA fan should say the same. But what about you all? What do you remember the most about this team? Who is your favorite Milwaukee Bucks player from that era? And why do you think they could never reach the finals? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.